to introduce our second morning speaker, Dr. Stephen Pan. He's an assistant professor of psychology at the National University of Singapore. And prior to joining NUS, he completed a PhD in experimental psych with a concentration in cognitive psychology at UC San Diego, followed by a chancellor's postdoctoral fellowship at UCLA. So Stephen investigates human learning, memory processes, and the optimization of these processes with the goal of generating durable and flexible learning. And much of his research focuses on evidence-based learning strategies, so very practical stuff as well, including pre-instruction testing, retrieval practice, and interleaving, as you heard from our previous speaker. Stephen has served as a special issue editor and action editor for Educational Psychology Review, is an editorial board member for 5 refereed psychology and other education journals. You've got to stop saying yes to everything. He was named one of the highest producing early career scholars in educational psychology in 2022, and he received the Association for Psychological Sciences Rising Star Award in 2024. I've known Stephen for many years. He's so creative. He's so generous with his time, working with students. So I know that he's at the National University in Singapore, and I just learned some fascinating things about Singapore. I definitely want to go visit. I want to go to a hawker stand, order, and just leave my phone in the middle of a crowded area and go get a Michelin star snack and then come back, and apparently my phone will still be there. That's absolutely fascinating. And Stephen also noted that the food standards are so high in expectations in Singapore that even the cafeterias at the university serve like top quality food. So I hope our conference meals have been up to the standards you've come to expect, Stephen. Please join me in welcome our next speaker, Stephen Pan.
Well, thank you, Joe, for the very kind introduction. And also thanks to everyone involved in setting up this fantastic conference. It's my first time here at EdCog, and I've already learned so much and found it so fascinating. So I'd like to start with a little demonstration. So here we have an image of one of the most famous locations in Singapore, known as Gardens by the Bay. Really famous tourist attraction. If you visit, this is perhaps the first place you should go. And I want to call your attention to the right side of this image, where there are these sort of tall, multi-story structures that kind of fan out. You see on the right side there? For those who have not been to Singapore, who have not been to Gardens by the Bay, just for fun, what do you think those structures are called? Does anyone have any idea? And by the way, these are assembled from multiple trees, multiple plants put together with a lattice structure underneath to form this structure. What would this be called? Any guesses? Yes. Banana trees, okay. Any other guesses? Yes. Okay. Very thoughtful. Yes. Okay, yeah. Well, you probably would only find this structure in Singapore, so yeah, there's some validity to that, perhaps. Any other guesses? Yes. Listening trees. Okay. So very thoughtful ideas here, but as to borrow Joe's intonation from last night, they're all incorrect. Okay. So the answer is super trees. So this is a super tree grove in Gardens by the Bay. It's quite beautiful. In the evening, they have light shows timed with music, free to anyone to visit. So the purpose of my showing you and asking this question is not just to do something on behalf of tourism in Singapore, but actually to illustrate a learning strategy, okay? What I call pre-instruction testing. You might have heard of it as pre-questioning or pre-testing. You just experienced a version of this. You were asked a question about something you probably did not know very much about. You made a guess. The guess was most likely erroneous. And then you were told the correct answer. Pre-instruction testing is a class of learning strategies that involve doing just that. Two of the most prominent are pre-questioning and pre-testing, as shown here. You might hear those terms used fairly interchangeably, but I'm going to define them very specifically right here. Pre-questioning typically involves practice testing on information that you have yet to learn. You make those guesses, and then you are presented the correct answer in the form of some study materials. For instance, you may watch a lecture, you may read a textbook chapter, and the answer is embedded in those materials. So you discover the answer afterwards. Pre-testing is very similar, but in most cases with pre-testing, the answer is given to you in the form of correct answer feedback, just like what we had done with the example with supertrees. Guessed, and then I told you what the correct answer was. Pre-questioning and pre-testing are sometimes known as errorful generation because it involves generating many, many erroneous guesses. So these strategies have been a great area of interest in my lab over the past couple of years, and most of our studies follow a standard design, as shown here. So there are 3 stages in this research design. We first have participants, students in classrooms, participants in the lab, engage in this pre-instruction testing, making those erroneous guesses. Then there are learning opportunities where the correct answer, correct information becomes known, either through lecture or through correct answer feedback, what have you. And finally, we have an assessment of learning, where maybe a couple days later, even a couple weeks later, we may ask our participants to recall what they have learned, to take a transfer test, something that measures how well they have mastered the information that we previously exposed them to. And we'll compare their performance on this assessment in the condition that engaged in pre-instruction testing versus a condition that did not. For example, if they just studied the information. If I just told you what a supertree was rather than ask you to guess first. And the key question here is it better to have made those incorrect guesses beforehand or to not guessed at all? So for today, I'm going to talk about my lab's work on 4 research questions related to pre-instruction testing. The first of which is very simple. Does it work? Okay. Is it effective for learning? Okay. And if so, then we can move into issues related to motivation, how to perhaps get learners to use these strategies. And one thing we need to know is what they believe about these strategies, what they believe about the related topic of making errors during learning. Another question that we're interested in is resources. How can learners be given the tools to engage in pre-instruction testing? For example, they might need practice questions, and those might not always be readily available. How can they get those questions? And also, what else can we do to help learners recognize and potentially be motivated to use pre-instruction testing as an effective learning strategy? Okay, first, does it work? Is it helpful for learning? And there are multiple studies that I could use to answer this question, but I wanted to choose this particular study because I thought it was particularly striking. And this was a study of pre-questioning and learning from video lectures, and specifically pre-recorded video lectures, which, as you may know, in some cases are sort of prone to learners, students finding them boring, after a few minutes tuning out, wanting to change the speed to 3 or 4 times to get through it very quickly, and so on. Right? So pre-recorded video lectures are ripe for intervention in terms of finding ways, for example, to help learners pay closer attention, help them learn more effectively from those video lectures. Okay, so the purpose of this study was to investigate whether if you insert pre-questions into video lectures, that pre-recorded video lectures, that would actually help their learning. And the video lecture we used was a 25-minute statistic lecture that was incredibly dry and boring and technical, one in which it's hard for some students to stay awake while they're going through this statistics lecture. So we have the statistics lecture. We will insert pre-questions into this lecture. I'll show you more on that in a bit. And we will have participants answer what essentially is a mind-wandering probe at various points throughout the lecture. Right? We'll ask them to report how closely you are paying attention to the content of that lecture at that moment in time. So here's the design of the study. I know it looks a little bit scary and complicated. I'm going to unpack this for you. So there are two conditions, a pre-question condition and a control condition. Okay. What we've done is we've taken the video lecture and broken it up into segments of around 5 minutes or longer. And in the pre-question condition, we'll have our learners answer a couple pre-questions before each segment. This is something you're going to learn. What do you think is the answer? They make their guess, which is often erroneous, and then they watch that segment in which the correct answer becomes known. And they'll repeat this process in the pre-question condition until they have finished the entire 25-minute lecture. Now, in this particular experiment that I'm showing you, the control condition would engage in an unrelated activity instead of pre-questions. They would just solve math problems. Now, in my lab, we've done other things. For example, we've had them read learning objectives that are related to the video. Similar patterns will result from doing that as well. So pre-question condition, control condition, they go through the same video, but there are different activities they do in between segments of video, and those red triangles represent when we probe their attention. And then 5 minutes after the video is over in this particular experiment, we'll assess their learning, see how well they've learned the statistics concepts in the video. So that's the design of this experiment. So what do we find? Firstly, with respect to attention, you can see across all the different time points and the different segments where we probed attention, the level of reported attention in the pre-question condition was higher than the control condition at all time points. And we've seen this pattern repeatedly in my lab with multiple experiments. Compare pre-questioning to reading learning objectives. We compare pre-questioning in this case to doing something like math problems. In any case, pre-questioning enhances attention throughout the lecture. So it improves attention. How about learning? How about on the assessment 5 minutes later? We see here that the assessment of learning pre-question condition is performing better. They've learned the statistics concepts better. And so here you have, I think, a very nice demonstration of the benefits of pre-questioning. Improved attention, improved learning. And also the level of attention is usually correlated with their performance on the assessment. So we have here a possible mechanism where if you have better attention, you're going to learn better from the video lecture as well. Okay. So clear benefits of pre-instruction testing in the form of pre-questioning. Now, there are many, many, many other examples. I'm just going to briefly show a few more. Learning facts and concepts from text. Pre-questioning is helpful there. Recently, we've completed a study where we have participants learn to classify different psychiatric conditions, for example, bipolar depression, so on. And if you ask people to guess what the condition is before they actually learn about it, they become better at classifying these conditions. And we've also recently completed a study where we had across an entire semester multiple lecture sessions where we administer pre-questions. And we have those pre-questions target material that's going to be taught in the next lecture. And we see a substantial benefit of doing that kind of pre-questioning on subsequent exams. So evidence, I think, is pretty clear that pre-instruction testing has considerable potential to yield multiple, so we say, desirable learning outcomes. So there's evidence that it is something that consider as a potentially effective learning strategy. But to be clear, we don't know as much about pre-instruction testing as we do about other strategies, such as, for instance, retrieval practice or distributed practice, what have you. Still not much more to be learned, but the evidence is very promising. And you might ask, well, what is causing these benefits? What are the underlying mechanisms? We could spend all day discussing that particular issue. This is an active and ongoing area of research. But let me just touch on it briefly with a theoretical framework here. Okay? So what is probably happening is when you engage in this form of testing, it is triggering certain psychological processes or states, such as perhaps curiosity, okay? Increased attention, motivation to learn the correct answer. Okay? You may also develop a memory of the guess you made, and I thought that the answer was this. I thought it was Singapore trees. Okay? That's a memory, right? And then when the correct answer is actually shown, when you have the opportunity to learn the information afterwards, you're learning it in a different way, or at least you're encoding it more successfully than if you didn't have that question beforehand, if you didn't have to guess beforehand. So your learning is potentially improved, and as a result, when there's an assessment later on, you perform better. Okay? So that's very, very, very broadly what is possibly happening, and we can discuss possible specific mechanisms. But it seems to be that asking people questions about information that they don't yet know the answers to, making them guess, is actually beneficial, possibly because of the processes going on here. Okay, so it is potentially quite effective. So now I want to turn to how can we get learners to use this strategy, or at least be aware that it is useful for them. Okay. And here I want to talk about a series of factors that may be important for motivating learners to use effective strategies. Okay. So one factor is knowledge about the strategy. Do they know what it is? Okay. Do they know how to use it? How to implement it? If you don't have the knowledge about a strategy, you're not going to be motivated to use it. What are their related metacognitive beliefs? What do they think about the strategy in terms of its effectiveness? What do they think would happen if they use the strategy in their own learning activities? Is this going to be helpful for them? Okay. If you don't believe the strategy is effective, you're not going to be very likely to use it. And a related issue is, do learners have the tools, the resources to implement a strategy? Right? Do they, for pre-instruction testing, do they have practice questions? Do they have the materials that they can use to engage in pre-instruction testing? And experience. Have they tried the strategy before? Did it work for them? Okay. Those experiences can be very important in how motivated someone is to use a learning strategy in the future. Okay. So this is a backdrop, I think, for thinking about how to persuade or move or encourage learners to use effective strategies. Think about these factors. And of course, these are not the be-all, end-all of the strategies that may be crucial. But I think these are potentially important, potentially determinative of whether someone is going to use a particular strategy or not. So first, I want to turn to a study that addresses knowledge and beliefs. And this was just a survey study in which we examined beliefs and practices related to pre-instruction testing, as well as the larger issue of making errors during learning. So this was a survey that was conducted at 3 large undergraduate universities in North America, 2 in the United States, and McMaster University right here, Canada. And we surveyed undergraduate students, over 1,000 in total, as well as undergraduate, their instructors, literally. Okay, so I want to just show you some highlights from this particular survey that I think are particularly informative. Okay, there were dozens and dozens of questions that we fielded, but I think these are the most sort of insightful. So firstly, with respect to what instructors do, what students do. So do instructors provide practice questions that could be used for pre-questioning, for pre-testing? Or do they provide practice questions that would be better used for retrieval practice, which is after information has been learned? And what do students do? Do they use practice questions before they have encountered a lecture or a assigned reading? Or do they tend to use it afterwards? Here are the results. So we can see that before a lesson, before a lecture, assigned reading, our instructors say that they do still provide practice questions, more so afterwards, but a healthy amount in both cases. But take a look on the right side. What do students do? Students rarely, if ever, engage in pre-instruction testing. They tend to perform retrieval practice. They tend to use practice questions after information has been learned. Okay? And to be clear, retrieval practice is one of the most potent evidence-based learning strategies known to learning science. It's absolutely a great thing that students are engaged in retrieval practice. But nonetheless, this result suggests that they are not taking advantage of this alternative form of practice testing. So why is this happening? What are the underlying beliefs that motivate this? Well, as we know, pre-instruction testing involves making many erroneous guesses. Practice questions on information you haven't yet studied, you're probably not going to answer most, if any of them, correctly. And so when we ask our respondents about making errors while learning academic subjects, how important it is to avoid making those errors, which is a hallmark of this pre-instruction testing, we see that instructors don't really think it is overwhelmingly important. But students, on the other hand, absolutely don't make errors during learning. They want to avoid that as much as possible. So you start to think about why there is this dissociation between what instructors believe and what students believe. Now, if we ask this question again, but reframe it in a different way, from the standpoint of being a successful learner, making errors or mistakes is a positive. We kind of give it a different spin. We see that instructors and students alike think that that's actually a pretty positive thing. So now we have a case where, depending on how you ask the question, students may or may not be positively inclined toward making errors during learning. So we probe this a bit further, and we ask students specifically the importance of correcting errors as well as studying errors during the learning process. And we see here that students overwhelmingly endorse both. Okay? So perhaps you can read between the lines or think about how these questions and these patterns go together. It seems like students don't like making errors during learning, but when they do happen, they should be studied, they should be corrected, probably as a way to avoid making those errors in the future. And now, this is very different from pre-instruction testing where you're deliberately making errors as a way to enhance learning. Okay? So it's all about, I think, error avoidance as being a driver of these patterns. Now, we also ask questions about study strategy effectiveness, and here's one where we specifically described what pre-instruction testing is. We compared it to regular studying, and we just asked students to choose which of these two approaches they thought would be better for learning. And we found that students are split. They don't seem to have a strong preference either way. And you notice the patterns are fairly similar across the different survey sites. So this seems to be at least fairly generalizable. So we have here from these survey data evidence that, firstly, undergraduate students don't use pre-instruction testing. They don't seem to have strong beliefs about its effectiveness either way, and they value making errors during the learning process primarily from the perspective of avoiding them happening in the future. So they'll study them, they'll correct them, but they won't necessarily engage in a learning strategy that involves deliberately making them. Okay, so now I want to turn to another sort of piece of the puzzle in trying to get learners to potentially use these strategies. We now covered related knowledge, beliefs, and practices. You may recall from one of the survey slides I presented, as shown here, instructors do provide questions that can be used before a lecture or assigned reading to some extent, but students don't use them. And there are other circumstances where students may not have access to practice questions. For instance, they have a lecture slide deck and there are no questions associated with that deck. Or their assigned reading doesn't have any practice questions. So where are they going to get those questions? Well, sometimes they might maybe go on a website like Quizlet and find questions made by somebody else. But there are other cases where there are just no questions available. And that's a very big barrier to using strategy like pre-questioning or pre-testing. But as we all know, in the past year, especially the past couple years, the education landscape has been transformed by generative AI, right? And one of the big advantages of generative AI is the ability to produce content very quickly, cheaply, in an accessible way. So here is a study in which we used ChatGPT to generate pre-questions, and we wanted to see how effective that is for student learning. Are the questions that AI generates useful at all? If so, that's a solution to the resource problem. So I'm going to show you one experiment from that study in which we had participants attempt AI-generated pre-questions before reading a text passage. Their learning was assessed afterwards. We compared that to a condition with no pre-questioning at all, and these participants, they studied an outline of the passage, okay, also generated by AI. Here are the materials. So the passage is a fairly well-known passage in learning science research on the subject of breaks, and it describes breaks, what types there are, how they work, and so on. It's great for evaluating understanding of processes and how machines work and so on. We engineered prompts to create pre-questions as well as to create an outline. Fed that into ChatGPT, and we got these materials. Here are some of the materials that the AI created. So at the top, these are two of the short answer questions that were generated. And below are a segment of the outline that was created. We reviewed those materials. They were highly accurate and seemed very promising. So we're going to have our participants either answer these pre-questions or study the outline before they read the passage. Now, I'm going to show you the final assessment that occurred after all of this learning, and you will see several question types. Okay? And let me explain what these question types are. Firstly, there are what I call tested questions. So these are the same exact questions that we used for pre-questioning earlier. So those that had experienced pre-questions, these are the same questions. We want to see essentially whether they have improved in their ability to answer those questions. But because they've seen those questions before, they might have an advantage because of prior exposure. So we also included what I'll call transfer questions, which are questions that are brand new to all the participants. They've never seen them before. And there were two types of transfer questions. Firstly, questions that we also generated using AI, okay, and examples here, as well as questions that we generated. Okay? We want to see, just explore whether any benefits of AI-generated pre-questions are specific to certain types of questions or more broadly applicable. So first, let me show you performance on this final test in the outline condition. They studied an outline, and here's how they did. So performance was actually quite a bit lower than we expected. So it seems that participants who have not engaged in any testing before the final assessment, they just studied, they just passively read the passage on breaks. When it comes time to answering these fairly challenging questions, they're not performing very well at all. Now, how about the AI-generated pre-questions condition? Head and shoulders above in every single case. So I think this is a nice demonstration of the benefits of using AI to implement a potentially effective learning strategy. Generative AI can create practice questions to elicit the benefits of pre-instruction testing. And that's probably not just restricted to this case. You can use it for retrieval practice. The possibilities are quite remarkable. But here we have a demonstration that it is helpful for learning. And in other experiments, we've compared the efficacy of human-generated pre-questions versus AI-generated pre-questions. And so far, AI and human-generated materials seem to be equally effective. So this is very promising from the standpoint of providing resources for learners to use an effective learning strategy. So going back to these factors, we've addressed knowledge, we've addressed beliefs, and we've come up with a possible solution to the issue of resources. So I want to now turn to this idea of experience. Can learners through experience become cognizant of the benefits of a particular learning strategy, such as pre-questioning, pre-testing? Or through experience, can their beliefs be changed and moved in the direction towards being aware, being willing to choose a given strategy in the future? Okay, so this study involved giving learners multiple experiences with pre-testing, which I'll go into a bit in a moment, and seeing whether that experience causes them to be aware that pre-testing is beneficial for learning. So here's an overview of the design of the first couple experiments. So we have multiple cycles. These are steps, phases in which participants learn information, we solicit metacognitive judgments, and then we give them a memory test. Okay? We're going through multiple cycles, and we want to see, as a function of the cycles they've gone through, the experience they've gone through, whether their beliefs change. Okay? So in each cycle, participants will learn a series of word pairs. I'll show you an example in the next slide. Half of those word pairs, they will read them. The other half, they'll be pre-tested. They'll guess one of the words, which is not shown, and then the missing word will be shown as the correct answer. Okay? So they've learned these word pairs, and then we're going to make them predict. If they were to take a test sometime in the future, the pairs that they learned through just reading them, how well do you think they would do? The pairs that they learned by pre-testing, guessing, followed by feedback, how well do they think they'll do? And then they'll take that test. Okay? So now they've gotten a taste of what pre-testing is like. They've got a taste of its effectiveness on a subsequent memory test. And then what we'll do is we'll have them repeat the procedure, but with a new set of word pairs, and see maybe the second time around, their predictions might have changed. And there's one more important thing, is after they've gone through all these cycles, we'll ask them two key questions. Well, actually, one is a two-part question. First question is that we ask them, what is the effectiveness of reading for learning these materials? And the second one is, what is the effectiveness of pre-testing for learning these materials? Okay? And then an additional question, if you were to learn more pairs in the future, which of these strategies would you prefer to use? Okay? So we want to see whether through this experience, they become aware in terms of their predictions of which strategy is better, in terms of their ratings of effectiveness, and in terms of their preference to use a strategy in the future. So here are some of the materials. Word pairs are semantically associated, two words that are linked together, presented together for reading, or presented one word first, you guess the second, and then you're shown the correct answer in the case of pre-testing. And the predictions are, as I described earlier, how many of these pairs you will remember in the future, in 5 minutes, and so on. And the ratings that we'll ask at the very end of each experiment. How effective is one strategy? What strategy would you prefer to use in the future? Okay. So let me first show you sort of our baseline experiment, where we have just done what I've shown here. There's nothing else added. And we want to see whether pretesting is effective, and more importantly, whether the effectiveness of pretesting is reflected in the metacognitive judgments that our participants make. And so here we have test performance. So there's cycle 1, cycle 2, proportion correct, how well they are able to recall these pairs. And those dots represent individual participants' data points. But the most important thing to focus on here are the lines. And we can see here that pretesting is performing better than reading in both cycles. So there we have yet another demonstration of pre-instruction testing being better for learning. How about the predictions that our participants are making? We can see here that there is a discontinuity where the predictions do not align with the actual results, where participants are benefiting from this strategy, but they don't recognize that it is beneficial for them. So this, I think, is yet another illustration of the challenge of getting learners to become aware of pre-instruction testing as useful for their learning, and then potentially motivating them to use it. Okay, so what can be done? Well, in this case, we see with experience alone, no interventions, there is a lack of metacognitive awareness. Okay, so we're now going to intervene, find ways to change, to move the needle. And we tried two things. Firstly, we told learners how well they did on each assessment. We told them, these are the pairs that you read, these are the pairs that you were pre-tested on, This is how you scored on each of those types of materials. And in almost every case, our participants are scoring better on the items that were pre-tested. So we told them how it worked. Okay? And we can translate to the classroom. If you have learners try a particular strategy, you can then maybe show them how effective it is by maybe taking a test and showing them, look, you performed retrieval practice on these materials. Look how much better that you did than some other strategy. Okay? So there are analogs to this in authentic educational settings. Now, one other particular intervention we tried was to give learners more experience, not just 2 cycles, but 3. Go through learning with these strategies over and over and maybe get more experience. And maybe that will help them become more aware that is helpful for learning. So let me show you firstly, again, the prediction data. So if you just tell learners that the strategies are effective, your test performance is better for pre-tested items, that doesn't seem to move the needle very much. But if you do that and give them more experience, it starts to show some separation. Not to the magnitude of the actual memory benefit, but there is now at least some indication that the learners are becoming aware that strategy is helpful. Now, it's also important to look at their ratings of effectiveness, their preference for one strategy over another. So here we have effectiveness of pretesting, effectiveness of reading on a scale from 1 to 10. Okay, and the left represents sort of the first experiment I showed you, the middle, the next one, and the one on the right side where they had multiple cycles of experience. And you can see only on the case where, on the far right case, where participants have multiple cycles of experience, not just 2, but 3, then their ratings shift to favoring the effectiveness of pretesting over reading. And then we ask critical question, in the future, if you were to learn more pairs, what would you prefer to use? We see also, only when there is extensive experience beyond 2 cycles do our participants actually then say, okay, I'm going to choose the more effective strategy. So this shows perhaps the lengths that you might have to go to encourage learners to become aware of strategy effectiveness and be motivated to use the better strategy, at least we think, better strategy in the future. Okay, so providing learners with information about strategy effectiveness and giving them extended experience seems to be the key. Okay, so what have we learned across these studies? Well, firstly, in terms of effectiveness, I think the evidence is now very, very strong. We have pre-instruction testing benefits across memory, some cases for transfer of learning for various skills. There are some indications that it can improve attention, for example, during video lectures. In terms of related metacognitive beliefs and practices, well, I think the key finding here is this aversion to errors that students commonly have, at least undergraduate students, and probably at different grade levels. And in terms of beliefs about the relative benefits of pre-questioning and pre-testing, our respondents tend to be agnostic. Okay? So there is clearly a lack of awareness and a lack of appreciation for the benefits of generating errors during learning. In terms of making these strategies more accessible, we have data showing that you can use generative AI to make practice questions that can elicit these learning benefits. And then in terms of trying to actually intervene to help learners become aware of the benefits of the strategy, become more likely to use it in the future, think about these different measures that may be effective, particularly giving them extended experience. So you can imagine having in a classroom students to try out a strategy in the first week, we may have them try it again, later a part of the course, possibly again after that, and that will finally get them to see, at least for strategies that are difficult to sort of appreciate, those measures may be necessary to get them to really be motivated or at least aware that the strategy is useful for their learning. And so to sort of wrap up here, are we ready to use these strategies in the classroom? Well, clearly there's a tremendous amount of additional research that needs to be conducted, for example, with primary school students. And we still don't fully understand the mechanisms that are involved. But I think the evidence is accumulating that, at least tentatively, we can attempt to implement these strategies, maybe on a sort of ad hoc, almost experimental basis, to potentially enhance student learning in various circumstances. And when we consider that students don't recognize that these strategies are helpful, they tend to avoid errors, there seems to be this untapped opportunity. You can imagine if we convinced students, or at least gave them encouragement to try these strategies, what kind of learning benefits we might actually be able to accrue. Okay, and with that, I want to acknowledge the many collaborators who helped with this work, my research team. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
This is great, by the way. Thank you so much. When you pre-question them, it's prompting them, of course, for things to look at during the point where you're teaching them. Do you feel like it's like when we do a pre-test, post-test kind of a intervention, we always prompt them by telling them, hey, here's some questions you might see. And so we're kind of prompting them to get the answers because we gave them some of the questions. Do you think that's a likely mechanism?
Prompting, you're sort of making them.
You're basically saying, hey, here's a question. And in some variations, this question is probably pretty likely to show up in the post-test because there's really only so many things you can ask about something. And students don't know that in general, right? But there's only so many things that are amenable to questioning. And so by making a pre-test or pre-questioning, you're just prompting them to pay really close attention to those things that are coming down the pike when they're looking at the material.
Yeah. Well, I think there's something to be said about that. I mean, as I think Joe alluded to earlier, in some classes, the better performing students are looking out for hints about what's going to be on the exam. And it's possible with some cases of pretesting, that's what they're doing as well. They're looking at the questions as, oh, this is a hint from the instructor about what I need to pay attention to. I think there's something to be said about that. At the same time, there are some studies, including one from Joe's lab, where the students were given learning objectives that also gave them a hint about what was to come up or what was important to learn in the class. And in that case, learning objective, you just study learning objective, is not as effective as being forced to guess. So I think there's something to be said about, yes, you're being given a hint about what's important to learn, but it's not just the hint. You actually have to make the effort to guess and to come up with a presumably plausible answer. And that's key. So it's both what you said, as well as some additional factors that I think are responsible. Thank you for your question.
This is on? Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. This seems to align with some of the mechanisms and efficacy of SQ4R, the reading method, having students glance at material beforehand, review it, and be asking themselves questions. Have you looked at that at all in terms of mechanisms or efficacy, or plan to, or have any other thoughts?
Well, now you've given me the idea, so I guess, yeah, we should. Well, there are, I think, in many cases, instructors are using pre-tests, or they're doing various learning strategies that could be reminiscent of the pre-instruction testing techniques that I mentioned here. And so if there is an element to that particular strategy of previewing the information, making some guesses about what you're going to learn, then yes, I would say possibly there's a common mechanism at play. But I want to emphasize that, at least in these particular studies, we're dealing with participants who don't know the information, and they're forced to guess, they're forced to come up with answers, and it's not just a preview of what's to come. And also, these guesses are, I would say, fairly effortful in the sense that you don't have any other material to draw on, you simply have your own prior knowledge to answer the question. There isn't any additional reading material. And that presumably forces you to really think about, what do I really know about this particular topic? As opposed to, oh, maybe I'll look at the reading material that's adjacent and try to figure out the answer there.
No, that's great. Just to follow on then, you're actually making me rethink the SQ4R for those who don't know is like scan, question, then review, read, right? Asking questions. It's 4 or 5, sometimes 6, depending. But you're actually having me think, how about switching that and questioning first before you're even engaging with the material, even at a scanning level?
Yeah,
thank you.
Well, I think we have to reconceptualize when and where questions should be inserted into instruction. Yes, with retrieval practice, you put it afterwards to almost consolidate knowledge. Participants or learners in studies, they are, literally thinking back to what they have studied previously. But what happens when you ask the question beforehand? That's a completely different kind of experience, and that can also be potentially quite beneficial.
I guess that's actually a good segue for my question, and is this temporally sensitive? Do you need to pre-question or pre-test within a certain time frame before you expose them to the content or the correct answers for it to be
Great question.
useful?
Great question. And it's actually an own sub-literature of this particular area of research. So there are a series of studies in which learners are encountering very simple verbal materials like paired associates, in which the feedback must be immediate, must be right after you make the guess. You have to be told the correct answer right away. If any intervening information is presented, the benefit is lost. Okay, so with those simple materials. So initially, there was a thought that, okay, these effects are highly sensitive in terms of the sequence of events, and the feedback or the correct answer must be encountered right away within seconds. But subsequent studies with more, shall we say, semantically enriched materials, such as text passages, lecture content, and so on, they've found that it doesn't have to be right away. It can be several minutes later. It can be possibly even days later. Well, the chemistry study that I briefly presented, we have the pre-questions on the lecture before the lecture where the answers are shown, which could be 2 or 3 days later. And we're showing pre-question effects there. So I would say there's sort of a gradient depending on the materials. Simple materials, and maybe you need it right away, the answer. But other cases, it could be later. Now, there probably is a point at which it's too late, that the question is long forgotten and you don't get any benefit. But my sense is it can be a bit later, not necessarily right away, for some of the very common educationally relevant materials, such as lecture content. Please, yes.
Great talk, thanks. I guess thinking about your work, you showed a great contrast between human versus machine-generated questions, but I'm wondering if you've played around with the composition of the questions in other ways, like multiple choice versus open-ended, or for instance, even the content. Like if you're asking someone, how do you compute the degrees of freedom for a t-test? That's not quite as exciting as maybe another question that might pique someone's interest. So just wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Well, firstly, the data I showed you, the prompt was indeed asking ChatGPT to generate open-ended short answer questions, and we actually even gave ChatGPT an example to follow. Would it be as effective if it was multiple choice, if it was some other format? I don't know fully the answer to that. I would say we did do some pilot tests in which we used multiple choice, and we didn't seem to get as strong of a benefit. But that also relates to the larger issue of test format. So in the retrieval practice literature, possibly similar patterns may be observed with pre-instruction testing. Certain more challenging test formats, short answer, where learners have to come up with the answer on their own. They don't have any provided answer options to choose from. Those more effortful tests tend to be more effective, and there's some meta-analytic evidence supporting that as well. So I would say that test format is an issue that is broader than whether it's AI-generated questions or not. But I would suspect that similar principles apply for AI-generated questions, that the more effortful types of questions are going to be more effective. But that's an empirical statement that could be tested.
Steve, I just want to add to that.
Yeah.
So I think that the types of questions you ask, it's really interesting. I think the ability of a student to come up with a plausible answer is also really interesting. So for example, the question that you asked about stats, if you know nothing about stats and you ask the question about degrees of freedom, I don't know. What's a degree of freedom? I have no idea.
Yeah.
So similarly, if I had to watch a lecture about string theory and someone says, how many dimensions are there? I don't know. I have no idea. I can't even give a plausible answer. So how important, related to the types of questions you ask, how important is it for a person to be able to come up with an actual plausible answer? What are your thoughts?
Well, firstly, there are a handful of studies I just keep going back to the literature and what I can think of that's relevant to your question. So I believe there are some studies with probably fairly simple, like fact learning. And a conclusion that some researchers have drawn is that the guesses need to be, as they call it, somewhat informed, meaning that you can't be completely in the dark as to what the topic is about. It has to trigger at least some general understanding of what the topic is about, and then your answer is somewhat plausible. Okay? If it is completely foreign, then you have no idea what this is. The question is essentially, could be akin to something written in a foreign language, and there's no benefit of the guesses in this case. And then related to that, there are indeed studies of pretesting where the materials are truly arbitrary and impossible to guess, or they are foreign language words and the participants in the studies don't speak that language. And in those cases, the benefits tend to be dramatically attenuated or even eliminated. So I would say, yes, you do need some degree of at least a little bit of an inkling of knowledge about what you're being asked about.
And I think my own intuition is that the more surprising the end result of that pretesting, the better. So I think the example that you gave about the super trees, I think we can all come up with plausible answers. But I think one of my favorite examples, when you ask people, what is the capital of Australia? Many people say Sydney.
Yeah.
And then you tell them, actually, it's not. It's Canberra. And then, for the people who really thought it was Sydney, they're like, what? Really? And then that's probably something they'll never forget because it's so surprising. Yeah. And in my own lectures, like one of my favorite use of pretesting, I love to describe a study with a counterintuitive finding. And then I ask students, what do you think happens? Guess. So for psychologists, cognitive dissonance is a favorite one. You set up this story and then you actually get them to commit to guess what you think the results are. And when they find out the actual results, they're really, really surprised. And my intuition is that I think it helps to consolidate that memory.
And related to that, as some here know, is the finding known as a hypercorrection effect, where when you are very surprised at your incorrect guess, then that actually is sort of a way to enhance learning. You become better at encoding the correct answer. Okay? So there may be an element of surprise that is also or even emotion that is involved in pre-instruction testing effects.
Thank you very much for your talk, and thank you for making so accessible. I'm from engineering, and I felt like I'm following through.
I'm so glad.
A question/comment. I remember when I was a student, when I heard from the instructors that, the marks don't matter, don't focus on the marks, failure is learning. I remember I used to become very furious when I would hear that, because I know, like, to go to grad school, the marks matters. Even to go get a good job, the marks matters. They look at those. And then I was very interested at the results you showed. I didn't catch the slide number where you asked the instructors, if I understand correctly, that do you think the students should focus on errors? And then when you flip the questions, the students were consistent, but the instructors weren't. So it's kind of hypocritical, I don't know. But what do you think about that rhetoric and coming from the instructors and how the students would receive it?
Well, I'm glad you asked this question, because I think it gets at sort of an issue that you might read between the lines and think about. And I think you were thinking about it, which is the fact that students' grades are on the line, right? They have pressure to perform, whereas the instructors don't. And so it's easy for an instructor to say, I know everyone here is pretty much an instructor, so I don't want to be too provocative, but it's easy for an instructor to say, errors are good for learning, and you can make them during the learning process. But I think from the student side, they're clearly more fearful of errors because they're thinking about the marks and the effect on their course performance, their future career trajectories, and so on. So I think it's the punitive nature of grading that is probably a major contributor to this aversion towards errors in certain ways among students that is not present in instructors who are probably many years removed from the experience of having their performance, their errors being very detrimental to their future. Thank you for bringing up that point.
I have a question for you. Over here.
Where? Oh, yes.
I was wondering if you or anybody you know of has experimented with rewards. Clearly, there could be different kinds of rewards. And where I'm coming from in this is thinking about how successful algorithms in, say, machine and deep learning have been at, say, winning games just by basically reinforcement learning, trial and error, incentivized by some kind of a reward. Just wondering if that transfers over to any of this or something you thought about.
I think it does in a sense. Well, I'm not aware of any studies of pre-instruction testing where reward was a critical factor, for example, for student performance, but there are studies of retrieval practice in which, for example, if you get answers right, you're incentivized with a little monetary compensation, or you get to leave the study earlier, which turns out to be a huge motivator for a lot of participants in studies. And so I'd say if you add that into the equation, then it might potentially make, it depends on where the incentives are structured, what their consequences of, for example, answering a question correctly or incorrectly, whether that yields monetary benefit or loss or whatever. And so it depends on the implementation. But I think there's something to be said about adding incentives to this set of learning strategies. And what do I mean by that? So for example, the chemistry study that I briefly alluded to, I don't have time to talk about it in great detail, but students in that class, they were highly motivated, and they were told that their performance on these pre-questions accounted for a small part of their course grade. And they were also told that these questions would be very helpful for them to learn in the class for future exams. And that seemed to be very useful. At least anecdotally, we have students paying a lot of close attention. They're trying to secretly take photos in class of the questions. And so adding incentives may actually, shall we say, juice the effects of these strategies. So that's a really great idea. Not yet investigated in the context of these strategies, but definitely another fantastic possibility.